Welcome to Javel Stories. Please support me by subscribing to my channel. This encourages me to create more interesting stories. Thank you so much as you do so. Eldoria was a kingdom of beauty and abundance, its rolling hills blanketed in lush greenery and its rivers sparkling under the sun's gaze. The people of Eldoria thrived under the wise rule of King Charles, a man revered for his sense of justice and deep respect for tradition. His leadership had seen the kingdom flourish in trade, agriculture, and culture. From the bustling markets to the serene temples where priests performed their rituals, Eldoria was a realm of harmony on the surface. However, within the high walls of the royal palace, a different story unfolded. Prince Edward, King Charles's only son and the heir to the throne, was a stark contrast to his father. Where King Charles was humble and wise, Edward was arrogant and impulsive. The prince, now in his mid-20s, was known across Eldoria not for acts of valor or leadership, but for his indulgent lifestyle and disregard for others. His handsome face and royal lineage masked a heart corrupted by privilege and unchecked power. The villagers spoke in whispers of his many misdeeds. Edward's charm and status shielded him from consequences, allowing him to take what he wanted, especially from women too frightened to challenge him. "A prince does as he pleases," they murmured, their voices tinged with both resignation and fear. For the common folk, standing against Edward was unthinkable. To question him was to risk everything. King Charles, for all his wisdom, was not blind to his son's flaws. He often observed Edward's reckless behavior with a mix of disappointment and despair. "A leader must be more than his title," he had told Edward on countless occasions. "Strength lies in earning respect, not demanding it." Yet his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Edward dismissed his father's lectures as the ramblings of an old man. He believed that power was his birthright, not something to be earned. The tension between father and son had been simmering for years. Queen Eleanor, Edward's mother, often served as the mediator between her husband and son, urging Charles to show patience and Edward to show respect. But even she could not deny that her son's behavior was becoming a danger not only to his future, but to the kingdom itself. She feared for the day when Edward's actions would lead to consequences no royal privilege could shield him from. One evening, as King Charles sat in his study reviewing matters of state, his chief adviser, Lord Frederick, approached him. "Your Majesty, the people are growing restless," Frederick began. "The prince's actions are beginning to cast a shadow on the throne." Charles sighed deeply, the weight of his crown feeling heavier than ever. "I am aware, Frederick," he replied, "but how does one guide a man who refuses to listen?" As the night deepened, the palace lights burned bright, and Edward lounged in the royal gardens. He was unaware of the storm brewing in his kingdom. Surrounded by laughter and flattery from his companions, Edward felt untouchable. What was one more indulgence, one more conquest? Little did he know his next decision would unravel the carefully woven fabric of Eldoria and set events in motion that no one could foresee. The tension in Eldoria was palpable, though Prince Edward remained oblivious to the growing discontent in the kingdom. His arrogance blinded him to the consequences of his actions. He spent his days indulging in lavish banquets, extravagant hunts, and the company of those who flattered him, not because of his character, but because of his power. To Edward, life was a game, and as the prince, he believed himself the only player who mattered. In the village of Greenvale, on the outskirts of Eldoria, life was much simpler. The people there were hard-working, their days filled with farming, weaving, and tending to the land. Among them lived Claire, a young woman of 24. She was known for her intelligence and determination, qualities that set her apart. While others saw their lives as limited to the boundaries of village, Claire dreamed of more. She was training under Margaret, the village healer, learning the art of herbal medicine. Claire's sharp mind and steady hands made her a promising apprentice, but her dedication to her family and community made her beloved. Claire lived with her widowed mother, Lily, and her two younger siblings, Daniel and Anna. Since her father's death, she had taken on the role of provider and protector, working tirelessly to ensure her family's survival. Despite the burdens she bore, Claire remained kind and optimistic, her spirit unbroken by the hardships of life. Her dream was to become a healer not just for her village but for all of Eldoria. She believed in the power of knowledge and the importance of compassion, and she worked tirelessly to embody both. One day, as Claire gathered herbs by the riverbank, the sound of hoofbeats broke the tranquil silence. She turned to see a group of riders approaching, their fine clothes and gleaming horses marking them as nobility. At the center of the group was Prince Edward, his confident smirk unmistakable. He and his entourage had ridden out from the palace on a hunting expedition, though Edward seemed more interested in leisure than sport. Edward's gaze fell on Claire, and he was immediately struck by her beauty. She stood tall and unflinching, her simple dress and braided hair reflecting her humility, yet there was an air of strength about her that intrigued him. Used to women fawning over him, Edward was unaccustomed to being ignored. Yet Claire, focused on her task, paid him no mind. "Who is that?" Edward asked one of his companions, nodding toward her. The man shrugged. "Just a village girl, your highness. Probably a farmer's daughter." Edward's smirk widened. "She's different," he mused. "I'll have to introduce myself." He dismounted and approached her, his steps deliberate. Claire noticed him then, her expression calm but wary. She had heard stories about the prince, and while she had never encountered him before, she knew enough to be cautious. "Good day, miss," Edward said, his voice smooth. "May I have the pleasure of knowing your name?" Claire straightened, meeting his gaze without fear. "Claire," she replied simply. "And you are?" Edward chuckled, clearly amused by her lack of recognition. "I am Prince Edward of Eldoria," he said, expecting awe or reverence. Instead, Claire gave a polite nod. "It's a pleasure, your highness. If you'll excuse me, I have work to finish." Her dismissal was unexpected, and for the first time in a long while, Edward felt challenged. As Claire walked away, he watched her go, a spark of intrigue lighting in his chest. This was not the reaction he was used to, and he wasn't sure whether to feel insulted or captivated. Either way, he wasn't ready to let it go. As the prince mounted his horse and rejoined his companions, his mind lingered on Claire. She had unknowingly ignited something in him, a dangerous mix of curiosity and entitlement. For Edward, this was just the beginning. For Claire, it was the start of a storm she never saw coming. The days passed uneventfully for Claire, but in the palace, Prince Edward couldn't get her out of his mind. Her indifference had struck a nerve, turning his fleeting curiosity into an obsession. He was accustomed to women throwing themselves at him, eager to win his favor. But Claire had walked away without a second thought, treating him as no more than any other man. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, and it stung. Edward's obsession with Claire grew more intense with each passing day. He sent servants to Greenvale to gather information about her. They reported back with details of her life, her dedication to healing, her family's modest means, and her unwavering reputation for kindness. These tidbits only fueled Edward's determination. In his mind, Claire was now a challenge he had to conquer. Meanwhile, Claire carried on with her life, unaware of the prince's growing interest. Her days were spent learning from Margaret, gathering herbs, and tending to her siblings. Her mother, Lily, noticed the increasing responsibilities Claire had taken upon herself. "You're working too hard," Lily said one evening as Claire prepared medicines by the fire. "You need time to rest," Claire smiled softly. "There's too much to do, Mama. Daniel needs new shoes and Anna's been coughing again. Besides, this is what I want to do. One day, I'll be a healer known throughout Eldoria, and we'll never have to worry about anything." Her optimism was contagious, and Lily couldn't help but feel proud of her daughter's resilience. Yet, a mother's instinct told her that trouble was on the horizon. The Festival of Light was fast approaching, a grand event held annually to celebrate the kingdom's unity and prosperity. The villagers were abuzz with excitement, preparing their finest clothes and goods to bring to the royal capital. Even Claire looked forward to the festivities, as it was a rare chance to step away from her duties and enjoy herself. When the day of the festival arrived, the streets of Eldoria were alive with music, laughter, and the aroma of food. Claire, dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress Margaret had gifted her, joined the crowd with her friends. Her siblings stayed home with Lily, leaving her free to enjoy the evening. Unbeknownst to Claire, Prince Edward was also at the festival, though his presence was less about celebration and more about spectacle. He sat on a raised platform near the palace gates, surrounded by nobles and courtiers, accepting flattery and praise. When his eyes scanned the crowd, they found her. Edward's lips curved into a smile. Claire was even more captivating than he remembered. Her dress, though modest, highlighted her natural beauty. Her laughter as she spoke with her friends was unguarded and sincere, a stark contrast to the polished charm of the court. Edward descended from the platform, ignoring the questioning looks of his companions. He weaved through the crowd with a single purpose, to reach Claire. When he stood before her, she froze, startled by his sudden appearance. "Good evening, Claire," Edward said smoothly, his voice cutting through the noise around them. She blinked, surprised. "Your Highness," she replied, her tone polite but wary. Edward extended a hand. "Dance with me." The crowd around them quieted, eyes turning toward the prince and the unknown village girl. Claire hesitated, feeling the weight of their stares. She didn't want to offend the prince, but she also didn't trust his intentions. "I appreciate the offer, Your Highness," she said carefully, "but I'm not much of a dancer." Edward chuckled, a hint of irritation in his eyes. "Surely you won't deny your prince this one small request?" Before Claire could respond, one of her friends interjected. "You should go, Claire. It's not every day a prince asks for a dance." Claire glanced at Edward, his expectant smile masking something darker. Against her better judgment, she placed her hand in his. The music resumed, and they joined the other dancers in the square. Edward held her close, his grip firm but not forceful. Claire moved stiffly, acutely aware of how everyone was watching them. "You're different," Edward said after a moment, his voice low. "I like that." Claire didn't respond, focusing instead on keeping her movements steady. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a simple dance. Edward's eyes bore into hers, his smile lingering but his intentions unclear. As the dance ended, Edward leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "I'll see you again, Claire," he murmured before releasing her hand and disappearing into the crowd. Claire stood frozen, her heart pounding. She didn't know what Edward wanted, but she knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. Claire returned home from the festival with a heavy heart. Though the evening had been filled with music and laughter, her encounter with Prince Edward lingered in her mind like a shadow. His words echoed in her ears, "I'll see you again." She couldn't ignore the unease that crept into her thoughts. Why would the prince, surrounded by nobles and women of high status, take an interest in someone like her? Her mother, Lily, noticed the tension on Claire's face as she entered their modest home. "Did something happen at the festival?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Claire hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Nothing serious, Mama. I danced with the prince, that's all." Lily's brow furrowed. "The prince? Claire, why would someone like him be interested in you?" "You must be careful." "I know," Claire said softly, brushing past her mother. It was just one dance. But deep down she knew it wasn't just one dance. Edward's gaze, his tone, the possessive way he spoke, it all suggested something more. She pushed the thoughts aside and focused on her studies, hoping to forget the unsettling encounter. Days passed, and Claire began to believe that perhaps Edward's interest in her had been fleeting. She went about her daily routines, gathering herbs, caring for her siblings, and assisting Margaret. Life in the village resumed its quiet rhythm. Unbeknownst to Claire, Edward's obsession with her had only grown stronger. Each day he found himself replaying their encounter at the festival, her grace and quiet strength captivating him in a way he couldn't understand. He was used to women vying for his attention, bending to his will, but Claire's reserved demeanor and refusal to fawn over him only fueled his desire to claim her. Edward began to devise a plan. He knew that simply approaching her again would not suffice. Claire was different. She would not be swayed by his charm or royal title alone. He decided to create a situation where she would have no choice but to spend time with him, where he could assert his power and break through her defenses. One evening, Edward summoned one of his most loyal servants, a man named Victor. "Find out where Claire gathers her herbs," Edward ordered. "Tell her there's an urgent need for a healer in the forest." Make it sound convincing, Victor hesitated. Your Highness, if I may, perhaps there's a better way to earn her favor? Edward's expression darkened. Are you questioning me, Victor? The servant quickly bowed his head. Of course not, Your Highness. It will be done. Victor carried out Edward's orders the following morning. He approached Claire at the village market, where she was purchasing roots and spices for her medicines. Excuse me, miss, Victor said, feigning urgency. I was told you are training as a healer. There's a woman in the forest. She's gravely ill and in need of immediate help. Claire's instincts told her something was amiss. The man's demeanor seemed genuine, but the situation felt unusual. Still, her sense of duty as a healer outweighed her doubts. Where in the forest? She asked, her tone cautious. Victor provided directions to a secluded clearing near the river. Please hurry, she's alone and I fear she won't survive much longer. Claire nodded, gathering her supplies and setting off toward the forest. She didn't notice Victor slipping away to inform Edward that the trap was set. The forest was quiet as Claire walked deeper into its embrace. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the path. The further she went, the more uneasy she became. The clearing Victor had described was up ahead, but there was no sign of anyone in distress. She called out, her voice carrying through the stillness. Is anyone here? I'm here to help. The rustle of leaves behind her made her whirl around. Her heart sank as she saw Edward emerging from the trees, his expression a mix of triumph and anticipation. Your Highness, she asked, confusion laced with alarm. What are you doing here? Edward stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. I wanted to see you again, he said smoothly. But I knew you wouldn't come if I asked. Claire took a step back, her pulse quickening. You lied to me. There's no one here who needs help. Edward's smile didn't waver. No, but I do. I need you, Claire. Fear gripped her as she realized the danger she was in. She turned to run, but Edward was faster, his hand closing around her arm with a force that made her cry out. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and menacing. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Claire struggled against him, her cries for help swallowed by the dense trees. Edward's grip tightened, his entitlement blinding him to her terror. For him, this was about power, control, and proving that no one could deny him what he wanted. For Claire, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would change her life forever. Claire's screams echoed faintly in the dense forest, but no one was there to hear her. She fought against Edward's grip with every ounce of strength she had, clawing at his hands and trying to twist free. Her fear was like a living thing, cold and relentless, but beneath it was a spark of defiance. She was not the type to submit easily, no matter how dire the circumstances. Let me go, she shouted, her voice sharp and trembling. Edward's smile faltered, but only briefly. Why are you fighting this? He asked, his tone low and patronizing. You're a common girl, Claire. This is a chance to elevate yourself. Do you know how many women would beg for my attention? Claire's defiance only grew. I'm not one of them, she spat. You can't take what isn't yours. Her words stung Edward more than he lay on, his pride wounded by her resistance. He was accustomed to submission, to people bowing to his will without question. This rebellion, this refusal to bend, infuriated him as much as it fascinated him. But his entitlement was stronger than his wounded pride. You'll learn, he said coldly, pulling her closer. You'll see this is for your own good. With a surge of desperation, Claire reached into the satchel slung across her shoulder and grabbed the first thing her fingers found. A jar of powdered cayenne pepper she had collected for herbal remedies. Without hesitation, she flung it at his face. Edward let out a howl of pain as the powder hit his eyes, releasing his grip on her arm. Claire didn't wait. She turned and ran, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The dense forest blurred around her as she pushed forward, not daring to look back. Edward's shouts faded behind her, but she didn't stop until she reached the edge of the woods and saw the safety of her village. When she stumbled into her home, her mother rushed to her side, alarmed by her disheveled appearance and tear-streaked face. Claire, what happened? Are you hurt? Claire's hands trembled as she clutched her mother's arms. It was the prince, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He tried to hurt me. Lily's face turned pale, her lips pressing into a thin line of fury and fear. "Are you sure?" she asked, though the answer was clear in her daughter's eyes. "Oh, Claire, this is dangerous. No one stands against the prince." "We can't let this go," Claire said, her voice breaking but resolute. "He thinks he can do anything because of his title, but he needs to be held accountable." Lily hesitated, torn between protecting her daughter and the grim reality of their situation. Standing against the prince wasn't just dangerous, it was unheard of. Yet, looking into Claire's determined eyes, Lily knew her daughter wouldn't back down. She had always admired Claire's strength, but now that strength terrified her. Margaret arrived later that evening, summoned by Lily's frantic message. When she heard what had happened, the healer's face darkened with anger. "This cannot be ignored," she said firmly. "Claire, if you want to fight this, I'll stand by you. But understand, going against the prince means going against the palace. It won't be easy." Claire swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought of her siblings, her mother, and the life they had worked so hard to build. If she spoke out, she risked not just her safety but her family's as well. Yet staying silent would mean allowing Edward to continue his reign of terror unchecked. "I won't stay silent," she said finally, her voice steady. "He has to face justice." Lily and Margaret exchanged a look, their own fears evident, but neither argued. They knew Claire's spirit was unyielding. If she had decided to fight, there was no turning back. As the sun set over Eldoria, Claire sat by the fire, her thoughts racing. She had no illusions about the battle ahead. The prince was powerful, and the odds were against her. But for the first time since the assault, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. In the shadows of the palace, Edward nursed his wounded pride and his stinging eyes. He swore under his breath, furious at Claire for defying him. What should have been a simple conquest had turned into an embarrassment. He would not let it go unanswered. "I'll deal with her," he muttered, his voice icy. "She'll regret ever crossing me." Unbeknownst to him, Claire had already begun her fight, a fight that would shake the foundations of Eldoria and test the limits of justice in the kingdom. The village of Greenvale buzzed with whispers the following morning. Word of Claire's encounter with Prince Edward had spread quickly, though few dared to speak openly about it. The villagers were torn between admiration for Claire's bravery and fear of what her defiance might bring upon their quiet lives. Challenging the royal family was unheard of, and Edward's reputation for cruelty left many uneasy. Claire, however, refused to let fear silence her. She sat in Margaret's small cottage with her mother and the healer, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "We need to take this to the village council," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Lily shook her head. "Claire, you don't understand. The council is powerless against the prince. If they even dare to hear your complaint, it could bring harm to all of us." Margaret placed a calming hand on Claire's shoulder. "Your mother is right. The council won't act unless there's overwhelming support from the villagers, and even then, they may hesitate. But there are ways to make your voice louder." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret leaned in, her voice low and serious. "You need allies, people who believe you, who are willing to stand with you. If you can gather enough voices, the council might have no choice but to hear your case. And if they don't, we'll take it beyond Greenvale. We'll take it to the capital." Claire's heart sank. The prospect of gathering support seemed daunting. Most villagers were terrified of Edward and the power he wielded. But she couldn't give up. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "If I stay silent, he'll hurt someone else." "I can't let that happen," Margaret nodded. "Good. Start with the people who trust you. Once you have a few allies, others will follow. People need to know they're not alone in standing against injustice." Claire spent the next few days speaking to trusted friends and neighbors, sharing her story. Some were moved by her courage and promised their support, but others were hesitant, their fear outweighing their sympathy. "He's the prince," one woman said, shaking her head. "What can we do against someone like him?" Despite the setbacks, Claire's determination didn't waver. Slowly, her circle of allies began to grow. Margaret was instrumental, using her influence as the village healer to rally support. Even a few of the elders, though cautious, expressed quiet agreement that Edward's actions needed to be stopped. Meanwhile, Edward was growing restless. His anger at Claire's defiance had not subsided, and reports of her efforts to gather support only fueled his rage. "She's making a spectacle of herself," he fumed to Victor. "Do something about it." Victor hesitated. "What would you have me do, Your Highness?" "Send a message," Edward snapped. "Remind her who she's dealing with." That night, Claire's family awoke to the sound of breaking glass. Rushing outside, they found their small garden trampled and a rock with a threatening note tied to it. "Stop or you'll regret it." Lily's face turned pale as she read the words. "Claire, this is too dangerous. You can't keep this up." Claire, though shaken, clenched her fists. "This is exactly why I have to keep going. If we give in now, he'll think he can do this to anyone." The threats only strengthened Claire's resolve. She gathered her allies the next day, meeting in secret to discuss their next steps. Together, they decided to take her case to the village council, despite the risks. It was a bold move, but Claire knew it was the only way forward. The council meeting was called the following evening. Villagers crowded into the small hall, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The elders sat at the front, their expressions stern as Claire stood before them. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began to speak. "I've come here today to seek justice, not just for myself, but for every person who has been silenced by fear. Prince Edward attacked me, believing I wouldn't have the courage to speak out. But I refused to be silent." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and murmurs of disbelief filled the room. One of the elders raised a hand to quiet them. "These are serious accusations, Claire," he said gravely. "Do you have proof?" Claire looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had supported her. Margaret stepped forward, her voice clear. "I was the first person Claire came to after the attack. Her injuries and her words were proof enough for me." Another voice joined in, Thomas, a blacksmith who had long been critical of the prince's behavior. "Claire's not the first to suffer at Edward's hands," he said. "We've all heard the stories. It's time someone stood up to him." The room buzzed with tension as more voices began to rise, some in support of Claire, others warning against provoking the prince. The elders exchanged worried glances, clearly reluctant to act. "We need time to deliberate," the head elder finally said. "This matter concerns the royal family, and we cannot proceed lightly." As the council dispersed, Claire felt a mix of hope and frustration. She had made her case, but the battle was far from over. Edward's threats loomed larger than ever, and she knew the next steps would test her resolve like never before. But for now she took solace in one simple truth. She was no longer alone. The air in the village was thick with tension in the days following the council meeting. Some villagers were inspired by Claire's bravery and spoke of standing up to the prince, but others whispered warnings of the potential fallout. The royal family's power was absolute, and challenging them was a dangerous game. For Claire, however, there was no turning back. Margaret visited Claire's home early one morning, carrying a basket of herbs and a sense of urgency. "We need to prepare for whatever comes next," she said, setting the basket down on the table. "The council might delay their decision for weeks, but Edward won't wait. He's already trying to silence you." Claire nodded, her resolve unshaken despite the fear gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. "He sent a threat to my family. I won't let him intimidate us." Margaret's expression softened. "You're brave, Claire, but bravery isn't enough. We need allies with influence, people who can protect you if things escalate." "Who would stand against the prince?" Claire asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "Even the council hesitates." Margaret's lips tightened as she thought. "There's one person," she said finally. "Lord William, the king's closest advisor. He's known for his sense of justice, and he's respected by both the court and the people. If we can get him to hear your story, he might help." Claire frowned. "But how do we reach him?" "He's in the capital," Margaret smiled faintly. "Leave that to me. I have connections in the city, people who can arrange a meeting. It won't be easy, but it's worth a try." While Margaret made preparations to contact Lord William, Claire focused on rallying more support in the village. She visited the homes of those who had spoken up at the council meeting, thanking them for their courage and urging them to stay united. Each conversation strengthened her determination, but the shadow of Edward's retaliation loomed large. That evening, Claire sat with her family by the fire. Daniel, her younger brother, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Are we going to be okay, Claire?" he asked, his voice trembling. Claire forced a smile and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll be okay, Daniel, I promise. We just have to stick together." Lily watched her daughter closely, her own worry evident. "You've taken on so much," she said softly. "I'm proud of you, but I'm also afraid." "Edward is dangerous. I know, Mama," Claire replied. "But if we don't fight back, he'll keep hurting people." "I can't live with that." The next morning, Margaret returned with news. "It's arranged," she said. "A contact in the capital has agreed to deliver a message to Lord William. We'll need to leave tomorrow if we want to meet him." Claire's heart raced. The thought of going to the capital both excited and terrified her. It was a chance to seek justice, but it also meant stepping into Edward's domain. Still, she knew there was no other choice. Margaret and Claire set out at dawn, traveling by carriage toward the city. The journey was long and tense, but Margaret's presence was a steadying force. "Remember, Claire," she said as they approached the gates of the capital. "This is your fight, but you're not alone. We'll face whatever comes together." The capital was a stark contrast to Greenvale. The streets were bustling with activity, the grand buildings towering over the narrow alleys. Claire felt small and out of place, but she straightened her shoulders and followed Margaret through the crowd. When they arrived at Lord William's estate, they were greeted by a steward who led them to a spacious hall. Lord William was already waiting, his sharp eyes studying them as they entered. He was an older man, his presence commanding but not intimidating. "You must be Claire," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Margaret has told me about your situation. I'm here to listen." Claire hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and began to recount her story. She described the assault, Edward's threats, and the council's reluctance to act. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it grew stronger. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Lord William leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This is a grave matter," he said finally. "The prince's actions are unacceptable, and justice must be served. But confronting him directly will not be easy. The king is a just man, but he is also a father. We must proceed carefully. What do we do?" Claire asked, her heart pounding. Lord William's gaze met hers, his eyes filled with resolve. "We gather evidence, rally support, and present your case to the king himself. If we can prove Edward's guilt beyond doubt, even the prince will have to face the consequences." For the first time in days, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but with Lord William's help, she might finally have a chance to bring Edward to justice. As she left the estate, she felt the weight of her burden lessen slightly. The fight was far from over, but she was no longer standing alone. Claire returned to the modest inn where she and Margaret were staying, her mind racing with the possibilities Lord William's support had opened up. The weight of her fight for justice was still heavy, but now it felt like there was a path forward. For the first time since the assault, hope glimmered faintly on the horizon. Margaret watched her apprentice carefully as they sat down to a simple meal of bread and stew. "You did well today," she said, her tone encouraging. "Lord William is a powerful ally. His word carries weight in the court." Claire nodded, though her appetite was absent. "But he said it himself, this won't be easy. What if we can't find enough evidence? What if the king sides with his son?" Margaret reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on Claire's. "We take it one step at a time. You've come this far, Claire. Don't let doubt hold you back." The next morning, a messenger from Lord William arrived at the inn. "My lord has begun inquiries," the man said, bowing politely. "He suggests that you remain in the capital for the time being. He may need your testimony again soon." Claire and Margaret exchanged glances. Staying in the capital was risky, but they both knew it was necessary. "Tell him we'll stay," Margaret replied. Over the next few days, Claire kept a low profile, venturing out only when necessary and always with Margaret by her side. The capital's streets were a mix of beauty and chaos, and the palace loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of the power she was challenging. News of her accusations had begun to circulate quietly, and she felt the weight of curious stares whenever she passed by. One evening, as they prepared for bed, there was a knock at their door. Margaret opened it cautiously, revealing a young man with sharp features and a guarded expression. "My name is Thomas," he said. "I'm here to help." Claire stood, her brow furrowing. "Why would you want to help me?" Thomas hesitated before stepping into the room. "Because I've seen what the prince is capable of. I grew up in the palace working as a stable boy. I've seen him hurt others and get away with it. You're the first person brave enough to stand up to him, and I want to make sure you succeed." Claire studied him carefully, searching for any hint of deceit, but his earnestness seemed genuine. "What can you do to help?" "I know people," Thomas said. "Servants in the palace who've witnessed things, but are too afraid to speak out. If I can convince them, they might be willing to testify." Margaret nodded slowly. "That could be invaluable, but it's dangerous. Are you certain you're willing to take the risk?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "If it means holding Edward accountable, yes." The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet meetings and whispered conversations. Thomas proved to be a skilled organizer, persuading several palace staff members to come forward. Their testimonies painted a damning picture of Edward's history of abuse and intimidation. Each new piece of evidence bolstered Claire's case and strengthened Lord William's resolve to confront the king. But Edward was not idle. News of Claire's activities had reached him, and his fury grew with each report. He paced the halls of the palace, his thoughts consumed by anger and a need for retribution. "She's making a fool of me," he snarled to Victor. "This ends now." Victor, ever cautious, hesitated. "Your Highness, if you act rashly, it could worsen the situation. The king is already aware of the accusations." Edward stopped and turned on him, his eyes blazing. "Then I'll handle it myself." That night, as Claire and Margaret returned from a meeting with Lord William, they sensed they were being followed. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of the capital replaced by an eerie stillness. Margaret glanced over her shoulder and whispered, "We're not alone." Before Claire could respond, two figures emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. Their intentions were clear, their movements predatory. Claire's heart raced as she realized Edward had sent them. Margaret stepped in front of her, her voice firm. "We don't want trouble," one of the men smirked. "Too late for that. You've been causing plenty of it already." Claire's instincts took over. She grabbed Margaret's hand and bolted, darting down a narrow alleyway. The men gave chase, their footsteps pounding behind them. Adrenaline surged through Claire's veins as she ran, her mind racing for an escape plan. They rounded a corner and nearly collided with a patrol of city guards. The men pursuing them skidded to a halt, cursing under their breath before retreating into the shadows. Claire and Margaret, breathless and shaken, explained what had happened to the guards, who escorted them back to the inn. As they entered their room, Margaret turned to Claire. "This is getting more dangerous by the day. We need to be ready for anything." Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. Edward's attempts to intimidate her only strengthened her determination. "He's trying to silence me because he knows the truth is coming," she said. "And I won't stop until everyone knows it too." The fight for justice was far from over, but Claire knew she had crossed a point of no return. The path ahead was treacherous, but she would walk it with courage, knowing that her voice was a weapon Edward could not easily silence. The morning after their narrow escape, Claire awoke with a pounding heart, the memory of the ambush fresh in her mind. Margaret sat by the window, her gaze distant but sharp. "We're closer to the edge now," she said softly. "The prince is desperate. That means we're making progress." Claire pulled her blanket tighter around herself. "It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like we're in more danger every day." "That's because we are," Margaret replied. "But you have allies now. Lord William is gathering testimonies and Thomas is working to secure witnesses. Edward can't intimidate all of them." As the days passed, Lord William pressed forward with his plan to confront the king. He gathered evidence, including statements from palace servants and villagers who had suffered under Edward's abuses. The pieces were coming together, but there was one crucial piece still missing: a direct audience with King Charles. Lord William arranged for Claire and Margaret to attend a formal council session at the palace. It was a rare opportunity to present their case directly to the king, bypassing the usual layers of bureaucracy. The stakes were enormous, and Claire spent the night before preparing herself for the most critical moment of her life. The day of the council arrived, and Claire felt a mix of fear and determination as she entered the grand hall of the palace. The room was vast, with high ceilings and ornate decorations that seemed to emphasize her smallness. King Charles sat at the head of the room, his presence imposing but not unkind. Beside him sat Queen Eleanor, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Edward was also present, his face a mask of calm, though his eyes burned with rage. He had been summoned to defend himself against the growing accusations, and though he maintained his innocence, the mounting evidence weighed heavily against him. Lord William spoke first, detailing the case with precision and gravity. He presented the testimonies of the witnesses, each one a damning account of Edward's cruelty. The council listened in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. Finally, it was Claire's turn. She stood before the king, her hands trembling but her voice steady. She recounted the night Edward had lured her into the forest, her words raw and unflinching. She described the fear she had felt, the pain of being silenced, and her resolve to seek justice not just for herself, but for everyone Edward had harmed. The room fell silent as she finished. King Charles looked at her, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Edward. "Do you deny these accusations?" Edward stood, his tone defiant. "I do. This girl is lying to tarnish my reputation. She's a commoner seeking fame and wealth." Before Claire could respond, Thomas stepped forward. "That's not true," he said. "I grew up in this palace. I've seen what you've done, Edward. You can't hide behind your title anymore." Edward's composure cracked. "You're all fools," he snarled. "You think you can bring me down? I'm the Prince of Eldoria." King Charles raised his hand, silencing the room. "Enough," he said, his voice heavy with authority. He looked at Edward, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "You've dishonored this family and this kingdom." Edward's face paled. "Father, you can't." "I can and I will," the king interrupted. "This council will deliberate on the appropriate punishment for your actions. Until then, you are confined to your chambers." Guards stepped forward to escort Edward away, his protest echoing through the hall. Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew the fight wasn't over yet. The council still had to decide Edward's fate, and the kingdom would need to grapple with the fallout. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder as they left the hall. "You've done it, Claire," she said. "You've made them listen." But Claire knew the hardest part was yet to come. The following days were tense as the council deliberated on Prince Edward's fate. The evidence against him was damning, but the weight of his royal status complicated the decision. The kingdom was watching, and King Charles understood that whatever action he took would set a precedent for justice or for impunity. Claire remained in the capital, waiting anxiously for the verdict. Her name had become a whispered topic in the streets, a mix of admiration and scorn. Some praised her bravery, while others condemned her for challenging the royal family. Despite the divided opinions, Claire held her head high. She had come too far to back down now. Margaret and Thomas stayed close by her side, offering their support and protection. Lord William continued his work, speaking to the council members and urging them to uphold justice. "This is not just about the prince," he told them. "It's about the future of Eldoria. If we allow this to go unpunished, what message are we sending to our people?" Edward, confined to his chambers, fumed in silence. His fury boiled over each time he thought of Claire and her growing influence. He had underestimated her strength, and now it threatened to destroy him. Desperation led him to summon Victor, his most loyal servant, one final time. "You have to do something," Edward hissed, pacing the room. "If they decide against me, my life is over." Victor hesitated. "Your Highness, there's little I can do now. The king has spoken and the council is firm. Even if I wanted to act, it would only make things worse." Edward's fists clenched. "Coward! Everyone's turned against me, even my own father." Victor lowered his gaze, silently acknowledging the truth. Edward was trapped, his arrogance and cruelty finally catching up to him. In the throne room, King Charles sat with Queen Eleanor, their faces lined with exhaustion. The Queen had remained silent throughout much of the ordeal, torn between her love for her son and her sense of justice. "What are you thinking, Charles?" she asked quietly. "I'm thinking of the kingdom," he replied. "Edward is my son, but he's also a prince. His actions have disgraced this family and harmed innocent people. I cannot ignore that." The Queen's eyes filled with tears. "He's still our child. Can you truly condemn him?" Charles's expression hardened. "I'm not condemning him. I'm ensuring that he understands the consequences of his actions. If we shield him now, we fail not only the kingdom but Edward himself." The council convened for the final time and the hall was packed with onlookers. Claire sat near the front, her heart pounding as the head counselor stood to deliver the verdict. His voice carried through the room, clear and resolute. "After careful deliberation, we have reached a decision. Prince Edward is guilty of the crimes brought against him. He is hereby stripped of his royal privileges and exiled from Eldoria indefinitely." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of approval and outrage. Edward, brought into the room to hear the verdict, stood frozen, his face pale. The guards moved to escort him out, but he resisted, shouting at the council and his father. "You can't do this. I'm the prince. I'm your son." King Charles stood, his voice firm, unyielding. "You were given every opportunity to change Edward. You chose this path. Now you must live with the consequences." Edward was dragged from the hall, his cries echoing in the vast chamber. Claire watched, a mixture of relief and sorrow washing over her. Justice had been served, but it had come at a great cost. Later, King Charles approached Claire, his expression solemn. "You have shown courage that many would envy," he said. "Your bravery has forced us to confront our failures, and for that I thank you." Claire bowed her head, her voice steady. "I only did what I had to, Your Majesty. For myself and for others." The king nodded. "It is my hope that this marks a new beginning for Eldoria, one where justice is not bound by power." As the crowd dispersed, Margaret placed a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. "You've done it," she said. "You've changed the course of this kingdom." Claire smiled faintly, exhaustion catching up to her. "We've done it," she corrected. "All of us." The fight was over, but the journey ahead was just beginning. Claire's courage had sparked a movement, one that would ripple through Eldoria for years to come. And though the scars of her ordeal would remain, she had found a strength within herself that no one could take away. The weeks following Edward's exile were a whirlwind of change in Eldoria. The royal court and the kingdom were still reeling from the unprecedented decision to strip a prince of his title and banish him. It was a moment in history that sent ripples across the land, inspiring some and unsettling others. For Claire, the aftermath was both a relief and a challenge. She returned to Greenvale with Margaret, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. The whispers in the village were quieter now, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Some saw her as a hero, others as a disruptor who had dared to shake the foundations of tradition. Regardless of the opinions around her, Claire held her head high, knowing she had done what was right. Margaret continued to mentor Claire, helping her refine her skills as a healer. Their bond had deepened through the ordeal, and Margaret often reminded her, "Your strength has given others the courage to stand. Don't ever forget that." One day, as Claire worked in the small herbal garden outside her home, Thomas arrived, his usual calm demeanor accompanied by a hopeful smile. "I thought you might want to know," he began. "The king has started drafting new laws. They're calling them the Clare Edicts." Claire looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "Laws to protect women," Thomas explained, "to ensure that no one, not even royalty, is above the law. Your bravery forced them to confront their failures. The king is making sure this never happens again." Claire felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The thought that her actions had sparked such change was overwhelming. "I didn't do it alone," she said softly. "You, Margaret, Lord William, everyone who stood with me, made this possible." "Even so," Thomas replied, his voice firm, "you were the one who started it. Never forget that." Meanwhile, at the palace, King Charles worked tirelessly to repair the damage Edward's actions had caused. The new laws were met with mixed reactions from the nobility, some of whom feared losing their unchecked privileges. But the king was resolute, and Queen Eleanor stood by his side, her quiet strength lending him support. Eldoria was changing, and though the road ahead was uncertain, there was hope for a brighter future. The people began to speak more openly about justice and fairness, inspired by Claire's courage. Villagers who had once suffered in silence now felt empowered to raise their voices, knowing they would be heard. Claire, however, remained humble. She focused on her work, tending to the sick and injured, and teaching others the healing arts. Her garden flourished, a testament to the resilience she had shown throughout her journey. One evening, as the sun set over Greenvale, Margaret and Claire sat by the fire, reflecting on everything they had endured. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Speaking out?" Claire shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. "Not for a moment. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was worth it." "Justice was worth it," Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with pride. "You've changed this kingdom, Claire, and whether you see it or not, you've changed lives." As the fire crackled and the stars began to fill the sky, Claire allowed herself a moment of peace. The fight was over, but the impact of her actions would continue to ripple across Eldoria for generations. She had proven that even the smallest voices could bring about the greatest change, and that courage, no matter how daunting, could transform the world. Claire had become a symbol of resilience and justice, a beacon of hope for those who dared to dream of a better future. And as she sat beneath the starlit sky, she knew her journey had only just begun. With the foundations of justice laid, Claire looked toward the horizon, ready to face whatever challenges the future would bring. The weeks turned into months, and Claire's life settled into a quieter rhythm. Though the turmoil of the past still lingered in her heart, her days were filled with purpose. Greenvale had come to see her as more than just a healer. She was a symbol of change, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. Margaret had grown proud of Claire's progress. Under her guidance, Claire's skills as a healer flourished. People from neighboring villages began to seek her out, drawn by her reputation for compassion and competence. Claire's small home became a hub of activity, with villagers arriving for treatments and advice. One afternoon, as Claire tended to a young boy with a fever, a messenger arrived at her door. He carried a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. Claire wiped her hands and took the letter with trepidation, her heart racing as she broke the seal. The letter was from King Charles. It was an invitation to the palace. The king wished to honor her formally for her bravery and to show the kingdom that justice had prevailed. The idea of returning to the palace filled Claire with a mix of emotions. The place where her fight had begun was also the place where her darkest memories resided. Margaret encouraged her. "This is more than an honor," she said. "It's a statement. By acknowledging you publicly, the king is cementing the changes you fought for." Claire nodded, though the thought of standing before the court again made her uneasy. Still, she knew this was an important step, not just for her, but for everyone who had supported her. When the day of the ceremony arrived, Claire donned a simple but elegant gown, one gifted to her by Margaret. As she traveled to the capital, memories of her last visit flooded her mind, the fear, the anger, and the overwhelming uncertainty. But this time was different. She was no longer alone, and she carried the strength of her victory with her. The palace was alive with activity as Claire arrived. Nobles filled the grand hall, their curiosity palpable as they whispered about the girl who had stood against the prince. At the center of the room stood King Charles, flanked by Queen Eleanor and Lord William. Their faces bore solemn expressions as they watched Claire approach. King Charles stepped forward, his voice carrying through the hall. "Today we honor Claire of Greenvale, a woman whose courage and resolve have changed the course of our kingdom. She stood for justice when others would not, and her bravery has paved the way for a brighter future." The crowd erupted into applause, though Claire barely heard it. Her heart swelled with pride and gratitude as she stepped forward to receive a medallion from the king. It was a symbol of recognition, but also a reminder of the battle she had fought and the lives she had touched. After the ceremony, Claire was approached by Queen Eleanor. The queen's eyes were filled with warmth and remorse. "You have my deepest gratitude," she said softly. "As a mother, it pains me to see my son fall so far. But as a queen, I know your actions were necessary. You've given this kingdom hope." Claire nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I only did what I knew was right." Lord William joined them, his expression one of respect. "The kingdom owes you a debt, Claire. The reforms we've begun would not have been possible without you." The evening passed in a blur of conversations and accolades. By the time Claire returned to Greenvale, she felt a sense of closure. The ceremony had been more than a recognition. It was a promise of change, a reassurance that her fight had not been in vain. In the months that followed, Eldoria continued to transform. The new laws ensured that power could no longer shield those who sought to harm others. Villages across the kingdom began to echo the message Claire had carried: justice was for all. Claire's life remained simple yet impactful. She focused on her work as a healer, training apprentices who shared her vision of a better world. Each life she touched was a testament to her journey, a journey that had started with pain but ended in triumph. As she walked through the fields one evening, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold, Claire felt a profound sense of peace. The scars of her past would always remain, but they no longer defined her. She was stronger now, her spirit unyielding. Her story had become a legend, one that parents told their children and elders shared around fires. It was the story of a girl who had dared to speak when others were silent, who had stood tall in the face of power, and who had changed the destiny of a kingdom. And as Claire gazed at the horizon, she knew her legacy would endure long after she was gone, a legacy of courage, justice, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest voice could change the world. Claire's days became a delicate balance of healing, teaching, and rebuilding her life. The world around her had changed in profound ways, yet she remained grounded in her purpose. Her simple home in Greenvale became a haven, where the scars of the past fade under the warmth of community and the steady rhythm of her work. Months turned into a year, and word of her story continued to spread across Eldoria. Travelers from distant villages came to meet her, seeking not only her healing expertise but also her wisdom. People admired her courage, but Claire often downplayed her role. "It wasn't just me," she would say. "It was all of us, every voice that refused to stay silent." One day, an unexpected visitor arrived at her door. Thomas, who had remained in the capital to work as an advocate for justice, stood there with a wide grin. "Claire," he said, stepping inside, "you wouldn't believe the changes happening in the palace. The reforms are spreading faster than anyone imagined. And the king, he's calling you the heart of it all." Claire smiled faintly, pouring him a cup of tea. "I'm glad the changes are real. People deserve to feel safe no matter who they are." Thomas leaned forward, his expression earnest. "They are real because of you. Your courage forced the kingdom to wake up. Even Lord William says Eldoria is stronger now than it's been in decades." As they spoke, Claire felt a quiet pride. It wasn't the recognition that mattered to her. It was knowing that her pain had not been in vain. But she also felt a deep sense of responsibility. The changes were just the beginning, and she knew the fight for justice was never truly over. Later that evening, Claire sat by the river near her home, the moon casting a silver glow on the water. Margaret joined her, settling on the grass with a sigh. "You've come a long way, Claire," she said, her voice soft. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Claire tilted her head, the question lingering in the air. "I do," she admitted. "Sometimes I think about leaving Greenvale, about traveling to other villages and teaching what I've learned." "There's so much more to do," Margaret nodded approvingly. "You'd be good at that. You've always had a way of inspiring people." Claire smiled, but her thoughts were distant. She could feel the pull of something greater, a sense that her work wasn't finished. The world was vast, and there were still so many lives to touch, so many stories to change. The following morning, Claire made her decision. She called her family and Margaret together and told them her plan. "I'm going to travel," she said. "There are villages that need healers, people who need to learn how to stand up for themselves. I want to help them." Her mother, though reluctant to see her go, nodded with understanding. "You've always been meant for more, Claire. Go, make the world better. With the support of her loved ones, Claire packed her belongings and set out on a journey across Eldoria. She traveled from village to village, sharing her knowledge of healing and justice. Everywhere she went, she met people who had heard her story and were inspired to stand against the injustices in their own lives. Her reputation grew, but Claire remained humble. To her, every life she touched was a victory. Every step she took a reminder of where she had started. The memory of her fight with Edward never left her, but it no longer haunted her. Instead, it fueled her, reminding her of the strength she had found in herself. Years later, Claire returned to Greenvale, her hair streaked with silver, but her spirit as strong as ever. The village had flourished in her absence, its people carrying forward the lessons she had taught them. Margaret greeted her with open arms, and her siblings, now grown, embraced her with pride. As Claire walked through the fields she had once known so well, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The world was far from perfect, but it was better than it had been, and she had played a part in that change. In the twilight of her life, Claire became a beloved figure, her story passed down through generations. Parents told their children about the girl who had stood against a prince, who had faced fear with courage, and who had shown that justice was for everyone. When Claire finally closed her eyes for the last time, she did so with peace in her heart, knowing that she had lived a life of purpose. Her legacy lived on in the lives she had touched, in the laws that bore her influence, and in the hearts of those who believed in a better world. Claire of Greenvale had become more than a healer, more than a symbol. She was a legend, and her story would echo through Eldoria for centuries to come. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me.